Welcome, EP Psychology students. We're going to talk a little bit about Module 35 today with you. I'm just going to be up front and let you know this is one of my favorite sections in the whole course, so you're just going to have to let me geek out a little bit so I can get really into this stuff. So if I start going off on tangents and stuff, I apologize. Might have to break this one up into a couple of videos. So it's all about how our mind solves problems, how we make decisions, and what I really like getting into is when we start talking about some of the shortcomings of this, some of the biases that we have when we try to solve problems, and some of the things that get into in the way while we do it. So let's dive in. First and foremost, a couple of major problem-solving strategies that we have. We can break them into a couple. The first one is an algorithm. This is just like a step-by-step logical process, and the key here is that it guarantees that you will solve the problem. This is kind of like an equation. You plug this in, you plug in this in, you're going to get the answer. Another example of an algorithm would be trying every single step until you get it. So if you look at you lose your keys, an algorithm would just be, I'm going to go back and look at every place I've been to until I find my keys. This is going to be different than what we call a heuristic, which is the other one. But if you try every single step, every single possibility, that's an algorithm. The problem with that is that can take a long time. You can't always do that. So while algorithms guarantee that you'll get the answer right, they don't always, sometimes they take a long time, and sometimes people don't want to do that, and I don't blame them. A heuristic, on the other hand, is kind of like a mental shortcut. This allows us to cut corners and to save time. Oh, I'm losing my lights. Oh well. So it's speedier, but it's not always right. Sometimes these can be error prone because you cut those corners, you miss information. You're relying a lot on prior knowledge and what you've done before, which is not bad, but again, it can be, it can set you up for error. So in this example, if you lose your keys, you can think back to where would you most likely have left them. You might think back to okay, where did I sit in the lunchroom today? Whereas an algorithm, you're going to go to every single class, walk up and down every single aisle. With a heuristic, you're going to say, okay, this is where I sat in Dowell's room. This is where I sat in econ. This is where I sat in the lunchroom. And you're gonna cut corners and save yourself some time. So heuristics can be effective a lot of the time. They're just not effective all of the time. We're going to talk about a few specific heuristics that we engage in a little bit later. This is another example of algorithms versus heuristics. So if you're trying to unscramble these letters here, which it doesn't take a rocket surgeon to figure out that this is the word psychology, but if you used an algorithm, you would have 907,000 combinations, ways of mixing those letters up, believe it or not, and that, again, nobody got time for that. And then heuristics, you would throw out things like, well, there aren't any words that start with two Y's, at least to my knowledge, so you could throw those out. So these would just be ways of trimming how much time you had to spend trying to figure out what the right answer would be. So algorithms guarantee success, but they're slower. Heuristics, they don't guarantee success, but they're right most of the time, and they're quicker. So take a second, go ahead and pause, and come back, and we'll talk about these questions. Okay, so it says, how might you use an algorithm to find your friend in the lunchroom? So if you used an algorithm, you might walk up and down every single aisle until you said, hey friend, there you are. Whereas with a heuristic, maybe you would rely on what did I do in the past? Or where do they usually sit? Or you might think about, okay, what classroom are they coming from? And so they might be closer to this area of the lunchroom or whatever. So some kind of a mental shortcut. What about finding a gallon of milk at the store? Well, again, you might walk up and down every single aisle until you found the milk. Um, and you'd find it eventually, just take you longer than needed. With a heuristic, you might think, okay, I know that the milk is not going to be in the deodorant aisle. It's not going to be next to the motor oil. It's going to be somewhere refrigerated. So I'm going to go to the perimeter where they keep all the cold stuff, and I'm going to check there first. It's going to save you time. So you go to any grocery store, whether it's in Iowa or out of state or wherever, and that's generally going to be true. Some other terms that are in this section, they talk about insight. Think of this kind of like your aha moment. So you're sitting there, you're trying, this happens to all of us. You're trying to think of a solution to a problem, or maybe you're trying to make a decision, and then you kind of have a moment of clarity where the answer just kind of appears to you. Or maybe, you're working on something in a class, maybe a math problem, and you can't figure it out, and then boom, it just pops into your head. The key takeaway here, we don't have an exact understanding of why this always happens, but one takeaway is to understand that even when we're not consciously working on a problem, unconscious regions of the brain are. So this is why I'm always a big proponent of, if you have a big decision, sleep on it. Wait 24 hours. And maybe you've had this where you sleep on it, you wait a day or two, and what was very foggy or muddy becomes much more clear to you, just to kind of let your brain kind of stew on it and figure it out. Maybe not all the time, but sometimes it does. And some of the famous research that was done with insight, there was a guy named Wolfgang Kohler, which that's one of the coolest names in all of psychology. He had these chimpanzees that were in these cages, like at a zoo. And he would give them these problems. Like one that sticks out to me is he'd have these bananas hanging at the top of a cage, and he'd have a few things that they could stack and get on, and then eventually get the bananas. And he wanted to see how long it would take them to get the bananas. And what he found was that most of the time the chimpanzees were just kind of sitting around. They'd look at the bananas like, dude, I'm hungry, let's get those. And they wouldn't do much, and then they'd have a boom, a moment where they'd say, oh, they'd stack the boxes, they'd jump on the boxes, or make little stairs or whatever, jump up, grab the bananas, and eat them. So it wasn't a thing where they were just continuously, nonstop, looking at the bananas and definitely thinking about them, but they seemed to think about it for a little bit and then wait, and then they'd have this moment of clarity. So that's insight. Some of the obstacles, things that get in the way of problem solving. The first one here where it says multiple hypothesis, really all we're getting at there is that sometimes there's too much information to consider. You ever go to you eat at the Cheesecake Factory and you have to read their novel of a menu? There's too much information in there, man. There's too many options. It's stressful. So there's too much to consider. Maybe if you're trying to pick a college and you're like, oh my gosh, there's so many factors. It's just information overload. That would be something that would get in the way of solving a problem or making a decision. Just too much to try to remember. The other one here, confirmation bias. This, man, with an election year coming up, man, there's so much going on that relates to a lot of these terms in this section. So confirmation bias, you probably see this. It's our human tendency to seek out information that confirms one's preconception. So we already have an opinion. Maybe we have a political opinion. And when news comes out, one side or the other, whatever, we have this tendency to pay more attention to the news or the information that agrees with our preconceived opinions. And we pay less attention to information that goes against our beliefs. And this is not just a conscious thing. Our brain automatically does this. Our brain gives more attention and more focused energy when we see this information. It responds differently when we see this information that we like and it agrees with our point of view, and it actively fights against information. It tries to block information that goes against our core beliefs. So it's a fascinating thing, and if you've ever wondered how we've gotten so divided in this country politically, confirmation bias is a huge part of it. You can literally have two people look at the same article, watch the same news, and come up with completely different conclusions based on the information that they paid attention to that agreed with them and the information that they blocked out that they didn't agree with. Some other things that get in the way, we experience commonly what's called fixation, which is just an inability. We have this tendency that once we figure out how to solve a problem, hey, this works, I'm not changing it, I've got it figured out, I'm just going to go on autopilot. Like, our brains love to do as little as possible sometimes. Once we figured it out, let's not change. And one term that's related to this is called a mental set. So again, just with problem solving specifically, once we've figured out a way to solve something, we kind of just naturally always try to approach similar problems with similar tactics, even if better ways to solve the problem become apparent. We oftentimes have a hard time seeing this. And this gets worse actually with age, because you get to be older and you're like, hey, I've been doing it like this, and why would I change? It's, I've been successful, but things change, and what used to work may not work anymore. Interesting one. This is not in the book, but you should know it. Functional fixedness. So it says a tendency to avoid using familiar objects in unfamiliar ways. So we oftentimes will not think to use something for a different purpose. So here on the slide it says using a dime to turn a screw. Maybe you have like a loose screw and you're like, oh man, I need to tighten this screw on this chair, it's going to fall apart. And you're like looking for a screwdriver, you can't find it. But all this time you could have grabbed a dime, a nickel, a butter knife, you could have tightened the screw that way. So, but if you are able to think of different ways of using an object, then you would be overcoming functional fixedness. So, and then another obstacle, this idea of overconfidence, which is basically saying those with the most overconfidence often have the least competence. It takes a certain level of competence to know if you are competent or not. So oftentimes people that are the least competent, they're not even aware that they're not good at something. They just automatically seem to be overconfident. We see this with students a lot. Maybe you've encountered somebody that you work with that just, they're not very good at their job, but they think they're all that in a bag of potato chips, but they're not great. And then the Dunning-Kruger effect specifically is this tendency for the most overconfident people to be the least confident. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in class later in the course. I think that's a good place to stop for now. I'll probably, like I said, make another one of these for the other half of the section. This is really interesting stuff. I really love talking about it. So we'll see you here in a minute for the next video, and thanks for listening.